Who are you? Why are you here? What is your purpose? What is truth? These philosophical questions of existence and its meaning have confounded man for as long as he has had consciousness. Countless interpretations of reality have resulted in a deluge of conflicting metaphysical arguments, seeking to explain the nature of man's existence and purpose. Underlying these interpretations are differing philosophies that attempt to explain truth. Many philosophies that arose during the Enlightenment period of the 17th and 18th centuries emphasized human reason and individualism over God and religion. The 20th century saw the rise of modernism, a philosophical approach that asserts reason and science are the most objectively reliable sources of knowledge and truth. At the heart of every one of these philosophies is a particular explanation of what constitutes truth and reality. One recent concept, however, has set itself apart from all other movements in that it rejects the very notion that past movements have attempted to explain. This movement, which rejects any notion of universal truth, has come to be known as postmodernism. Postmodernism is a reaction against the tenets of modernist philosophy. Christian scholar and professor Nancy Pearcey writes that postmodernism completely redefines truth as being relative and interpretable among communities, based on their particular perception of what truth is. Put in simpler terms, every individual has his own subjective truth that has been defined and conditioned by his community and identity. Theologian and scholar John G. Stackhouse describes the postmodern view of knowledge by saying human knowledge is limited by, restricted to, and characterized by the quality of a particular viewpoint, a certain place, a certain time, a certain light, and so on. There is no absolute viewpoint, no general view of things. The French 20th century postmodern philosopher Jean-François Lyotard defined postmodernism in the simplest way as the incredulity towards meta-narratives. There exists no absolute truth, no grand narrative or explanatory method to explain reality or give it meaning. According to postmodern belief, any attempt at claiming objective truth is an oppressive act of power that holds no legitimacy due to its subjective and limited perspective. Pearcey explains, in our own day, this has led to the extreme conclusion that everyone's ideas are merely social constructions, stitched together by cultural forces. Individuals are little more than mouthpieces for communities, based on race, class, gender, ethnicity, and sexual identity. The confidence in searching for sound knowledge in order to improve our lives has been lost in postmodernity. Though it may not seem evident at first, modern society constantly suffers the effects of postmodernism. One of the ways this influence is exhibited is through secular ideology. Secular culture embodies the famous words of Friedrich Nietzsche, "God is dead." Mark J. Cherry, professor of philosophy at St. Edward's University in Austin, Texas, writes, "Without God, knowledge claims cannot be grounded in reality itself. Absent such a foundation in being, truth no longer means the correspondence between a proposition and reality, but is always the product of interpretation. When God and objective truth are rejected, man becomes the author of his own reality, and absolute personal autonomy is assumed. As the Greek philosopher Protagoras so accurately stated, without God, man is the measure of all things." In order to clarify some common terms that will be used in this thesis, truth will be defined as that which is true or in accordance with fact or reality. Autonomy will be defined as the capacity to be one's own person, to live one's life according to reasons and motives that are taken as one's own and not the product of manipulative or distorting external forces. Rooted in mankind's fallen nature, postmodernism has produced a society dangerously obsessed with human autonomy. Through the denial of all objective truths and values, individuals are granted a limitless ability to direct every aspect of their lives as they please. Postmodernism has influenced every aspect of our modern age, beginning with the individual, then permeating the family, and finally spilling into the very framework of society. The first effects of postmodernism begin with the individual. Postmodernism completely alters the way an individual perceives reality. If no absolute truths or values exist outside of the human mind, then it is the human mind that constructs its own truths and values. Unfortunately, this mentality has no stable foundation, as it is based purely on earthly judgments and fallible human insight. When reality is left up to subjective interpretation rather than objective explanation, the individual is left with the futile task of crafting the meaning of his existence without any established guidelines or rules. The postmodern idea that an individual can craft reality and define himself however he desires can be summed up in the term expressive individualism. Expressive individualism regards concepts such as personal freedom, self-expression, and self-actualization as the highest good. Expressive individualism, however, creates serious consequences. Joshua D. Chatraw, associate professor of apologetics and theology at Liberty University, writes, Expressive individualism corrodes interpersonal relationships. Neighbors, friends, and marriages are viewed instrumentally, quickly abandoned if they cease to serve as a means for self-actualization. Even worse, Christianity is viewed with utter contempt, for its demands of personal commitment to God and moral accountability are detrimental to the individual's right to live autonomously. American theologian Francis Schaeffer says that Christianity is the hardest religion in the world for this very reason. He writes, "The heart of the rebellion of Satan and man was to be autonomous, and accepting the Christian faith robs us not of our existence, not of our worth, but it robs us completely of being autonomous." A society that obsesses over individualism and scorns religion will reap unfortunate consequences. It has become evident that contemporary culture regards God as an idea that religious people can enjoy on their own, but must keep out of mainstream dialogue. God is replaced by whatever gives one a sense of fulfillment. Take, for example, New Age spirituality. Many people today claim to be spiritual but not religious, and often participate in practices such as yoga, meditation, spiritual retreats, and other activities that focus on the self and inner exploration rather than God or transcendental truths. In one study, researcher Jeffrey Evangel found that non-religious spirituality predicted an increase in depressive symptoms. In fact, Evangel suggests that depression and spirituality may share similar cognitive patterns because both are characterized by internal searches for meaning that are insatiable. In other words, searching for meaning and purpose through the self alone, a method promoted by spirituality, expressive individualism, and postmodernism, is much like the thought pattern that leads to depression. Perhaps there is a link between the culture's growing emphasis on individualism and the fact that depression is on the rise in the US, and suicide is now the 10th leading cause of death. Reality and ultimate purpose cannot be determined by the individual alone, and doing so will always result in hopeless defeat by pursuing a poor substitute for God. Once the effects of postmodernity permeate the individual, it is only natural that they seep into the individual's most basic and fundamental social group, the family. The roles of husband and wife, or father and mother, are God-ordained responsibilities that reflect His good and perfect nature. These relationships constitute a fundamental part of humanity's purpose to fill the earth and subdue it. Postmodern societies, however, view the biblical model of marriage with contempt, as a socially constructed restraint that keeps one from achieving personal fulfillment. Marriage loses its covenantal value and becomes a mere contractual relationship used for personal gratification. As Mark J. Cherry puts it, in such terms, a wide variety of family types, including homosexual unions, non-marital cohabitation, single parents, group living arrangements with open sexual practices, and so forth, are each equally affirmed as permissible, perhaps even good, provided that they're consensual. Concepts such as traditional marriage inhibit personal freedom and place limitations on the autonomy granted by a postmodern culture. Just as the institution of marriage has become a product of relativistic interpretation, so has the entire process of reproduction. Due to a rapid growth in scientific innovation and technology, alternatives to the traditional methods of procreation have arisen, such as IVF and surrogate motherhood. When couples are unable to reproduce naturally, in vitro fertilization, the process of combining eggs and sperm outside the body in a laboratory before being placed in a uterus, is a popular alternative. During the process, procedures such as pre-implantation genetic diagnosis are performed to help identify and discard embryos with genetic defects. This procedure casually disposes of human lives to avoid the risk of children being born with diseases and disorders. Surrogacy is another example of an alternative method to procreation. Women are paid by couples to gestate and deliver their children. In this line of work, women are merely hired laborers, paid to undergo pregnancy for the convenience of a couple. A desire to procreate is a pure and virtuous one, and the inability to bear children is tragic and heartbreaking. Using methods such as IVF or surrogate motherhood, however, can be very morally problematic. Finding a solution to infertility is a good and important endeavor, but making sure the solution treats human life as possessing God-given dignity is just as essential. Christians should be highly cautious when approaching methods such as IVF or surrogate motherhood, as both these practices inherently commodify embryos, which in essence are little, helpless humans. The undermining of the traditional family structure not only corrupts God's design for marriage and childbearing, but also poses hazardous effects on the children who must adapt to these irregular family conditions. Take, for example, the effects on children raised by unmarried couples. According to recent studies, the number of cohabiting couples with children has almost tripled since the late 1990s. Children living with biological cohabiting parents are over 4 times as likely to be physically, sexually, and emotionally abused, and are more likely to use drugs, suffer from depression, and drop out of school when compared to children living with married parents. The facts are indisputable. Children grow in objectively better environments when raised by 2 married parents. The current postmodern culture shuns the traditional design for marriage and encourages an unconventional family structure defined by the individual interests of its members. This, like every other entity crafted through autonomy, ultimately leads to chaos. Once the state of postmodernity has instilled its principles of self-rule into the minds of the individuals who make up the family, it is only natural that this tendency towards self-governance permeates into the very framework of society. Education has been greatly influenced by postmodern principles. In a postmodern context, teachers exist to help the students construct their own personally beneficial knowledge. Former White House counsel and Christian author Charles Colson expounds on this consequence. Increasingly, classroom time is taken away from studying the classics of Western culture and is devoted to politically correct causes, based on a philosophy of postmodernism that reduces truth to power politics and treats all ideas as expressions of race, class, or gender. According to Frederick Sommers of Brandeis University, education is defined as a means to empower students by alerting them to the need for struggle against patriarchy, racism, and classism. On the contrary, properly training students to truly be knowledgeable and wise calls for an objective approach to education that recognizes the existence of universal truths and values. Students should be treated as image bearers of God, possessing full human dignity and a capacity to seek out truth, beauty, and goodness. A functional society needs an educated populace, and a vital civilization needs an established government. Politics and government have been affected by postmodernism in many ways, most notably in constitutional and legal interpretation. Many progressives today interpret the Constitution as a living constitution, meaning it can quickly evolve over time by adapting to changing circumstances without undergoing formal amendment. This popular development in law interprets the Constitution not based on those who originally wrote it, but on what people in the current time take it to mean. Take, for example, the California Supreme Court in the 1980s and 90s, when Rose Byrd served as Chief Justice. In over 60 successive death penalty cases, Byrd, a staunch opponent of capital punishment, voted to overturn every single case due to the defendants not being given a fair trial as required by the Constitution. As American economist Thomas Sowell put it, either there was not a single judge in the entire state of California who ever gave a murderer a fair trial, or else Rose Byrd was simply using this claim as a pretense to enforce her own personal opposition to the death penalty. If something is firmly established as a constitution can be subject to sudden change due to personal distaste, how can it be deemed as a reliable reference point for justice? Postmodern interpretation of historical documents, such as the Constitution, can turn what was once a respectable basis of law into an unpredictable tool rooted in ambiguity. At this point, it may seem as if no entity in modern society can escape the effects of postmodern culture, except for perhaps God's church. However, even the church is not free of cultural conformity, as many modern churchgoers seem to be either consciously or unconsciously drifting towards a postmodern mentality. A 2018 survey conducted by Ligonier Ministries found that 54% of Christians agreed that religious belief is a matter of personal opinion, not objective truth. 74% of Christians agreed that God accepts the worship of all religions, including Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. These findings show the powerful effects of postmodernism on modern Christian theology. For God's own church to succumb to the forces of relativism can be demoralizing. Christians must take heart, however, and remember that God's predominance never falters, and every situation, no matter how seemingly hopeless, works for his glory. In an age of postmodernism, followers of Christ must be loving but resolute in guiding those who are lost to the truth. One may ask what exactly it is that makes postmodernism more harmful than any other secular ideology. Postmodernism is more dangerous than any other ideology because it is inherently opposed to the concept of ideology itself. Postmodern thought declares any philosophy or worldview that attempts to give meaning and structure to life false. This conclusion leads to a complete lack of discernment and a downward spiral into philosophical pluralism, where truth and opinion hold equal value. A Christian might ask, is there any way to resist or reverse the destructive effects that derive from this postmodern age? The answer to this is found in the supreme and perfect nature of God. Postmodernism reduces claims of truth to subjective opinions. Christians, however, believe in a timeless and transcendent truth, one that supersedes any fallible skepticism created by man. The postmodernist is not only refuted by the existence of an ageless truth established by God, but he is also disproven by his own philosophical claims. The postmodernist claims that the individual is situated within a specific historical context along with his views and ideas. However, the postmodernist himself is also confined to a particular historical context. As Nancy Pearcey explains, postmodernists are just as restricted by their own historical horizons as the more traditional people whom they tend to look down on. The postmodern individual resides in a precarious age of relativism. In such a threatening time as this, Christians must be able to identify the damaging effects of postmodernity and prevent themselves from conforming to growing cultural norms by actively living out a biblically objective worldview. Paul effectively communicates this in Colossians 2:8 when he writes, "See to it that no one takes you captive through philosophy and empty deception, according to the tradition of men, according to the elementary principles of this world, rather than according to Christ." Every moral dilemma and cultural crisis mentioned thus far is actively occurring as this thesis is being delivered. If you are not aware of it, you are probably either consciously or unconsciously succumbing to it. Does your worldview reflect the teachings of Christ? Do you pursue only that which is beautiful, that which is good, and that which is genuine? And most importantly, who defines truth? Thank you.
Thank you, Merritt. Why did you choose your topic?
So originally, my thesis topic was going to be on the decaying mental health of our society. And so I did some research into some of the problems that are afflicting our society regarding mental health, such as depression and suicide. And my thesis advisor was Mr. Pike, and he kind of encouraged me to figure out like what are some of the root causes of these like mental health epidemics, and what could be some underlying roots of these. And I kind of did some more research, and I kind of came to the conclusion that it's most likely has something to do with our culture's strong emphasis on individualism and our pursuit of personal happiness, and how that ultimately fails. And so we talked about that, and we talked about autonomy, and eventually postmodernism was mentioned in one of our discussions, and I just kind of took that and eventually came up with this thesis.
What current trends in church life and worship do you see as symptoms of corrosive autonomy?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
What current trends in church life and worship do you see as symptoms of corrosive autonomy?
Well, so there's this idea of kind of theological relativism that we see in the surveys conducted by Ligonier Ministries, where we kind of interpret theology personally, as God accepts the worship of all religions, or religious opinion is a matter of personal opinion, not objective truth. So I think that would be one of the biggest effects that we can see firsthand. And I'm sure I could analyze that more, but it would take a little more thinking.
Is it possible to believe in a living constitution, respecting the idea that 1781 was different than 2019, without being a postmodernist?
Yes, so I don't think making revisions to the Constitution is bad in any way. I mean, of course we've done that with slavery and all the legal developments that we've had, but what's key to that is the idea of formal amendment. And that formal amendment is kind of neglected in the interpretation of the Constitution when it's a living document.
Is there a difference between relativism and postmodernism?
Relativism is an idea that is found within postmodernism, the idea that truth and opinion hold equal value, but postmodernism is not an idea found in relativism. It's not the other way around.
Are surrogate mothers always morally wrong?
I'm not going to say definitively they're always morally wrong, but I think that we should take extreme moral caution when approaching issues like that. I think that they do commodify embryos. I think that it's harmful not only for the embryo, but also for the mother. I think there are also a lot of negative effects, especially when the mother has gestated and kept the baby for 9 months, and then when the baby is taken away, there's that kind of feeling of isolation from this baby that you had this connection to for so long. And I think there are a lot of health issues and moral issues that we should consider when we look at an issue like that.
Thank you, Merritt.
Thank you.